So today, we're going to talk about a man who absolutely captivated millions of people, William Marion Branham. Now, to his followers, he wasn't just some preacher. No, he was a prophet, maybe even the final prophet before the world was supposed to end. But the real question is, how do those incredible claims actually hold up when you look at the facts? Let's dig in and find out.
And I'm not exaggerating. His influence was huge. The entire movement, which is known as the Message, is built on this one core idea, that William Branham was the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. You know, a modern-day Elijah, sent to get the church ready for its final hours. That is a truly staggering claim for any person to make.
And with a claim that big, well, you'd expect some big predictions to go with it. And boy, did he deliver. This one right here, about the year 1977, is probably his most famous. He wasn't just guessing either. He made it very clear this prediction came directly from a series of divine visions.
So there it is. The line was drawn in the sand. A specific date was given. For his followers, this was it. This was the timeline for the end of the world as they knew it.
And, of course, 1977 came, and then it went. The world just kept on turning. And that brings up a really crucial question that's way bigger than just one single failed prediction. So you have to ask, right? If that cornerstone prophecy just crumbled, what about the very foundation it was built on? In this explainer, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're putting the story of William Branham to the test, comparing what he said against the cold, hard, documented facts.
All right, let's start with the first, and you could say the most important pillar, the actual test of a prophet. I mean, if someone claims they're speaking for God, there's a very, very clear standard we're supposed to use to judge what they say.
And that standard comes right from the Bible. In Deuteronomy 18, it sets the bar incredibly high. There is zero room for error. It's not about getting most of your predictions right, it's about getting all of them right. You know, getting a 99% on this test is still a complete fail. So with that 100% standard in mind, let's look at another one of Branham's big claims.
So Branham used to tell this really dramatic story about a vision he had when he was just a kid. He said he predicted that the municipal bridge in his hometown would collapse and that 16 men would die. What a story. But here's the thing. When historians and researchers actually went and checked the public records, newspaper archives, city documents, you name it, they found nothing. No bridge collapse, no 16 deaths, and maybe most importantly, there is zero evidence he ever told anyone this prophecy before the bridge was even constructed.
And this is where we start to see a really interesting pattern, something you could call retroactive prophecy. Branham claimed he had these 7 world-changing visions way back in 1933. Incredible, right? The problem is, nobody seems to have heard a thing about them until the 1950s and 60s, long after Mussolini was gone and World War II was over. And you've got to be honest, predicting something after it already happened, well, that's not prophecy, that's just history.
Okay, so the predictions about the future are looking pretty shaky. Let's move to our second pillar now. Let's shift from his prophecies about the world to the stories he told about himself. Was the man's own life story as solid as he wanted people to believe? This image, it's probably one of the most iconic symbols of his entire ministry. A strange, mysterious cloud that appeared over Arizona in 1963. Branham would later claim this was a supernatural sign, a cloud of 7 angels who came to visit him. But just look at the timeline. The cloud, which we now know was from a military rocket that exploded, appeared on February 28th over Flagstaff. But Branham, he wasn't even there. He was almost 200 miles away, and his hunting trip didn't even start until about a week after the cloud was already gone. He took a real event and just wove it into his personal story after the fact.
You know how every superhero has an origin story? Well, for Branham, it was this incredible tale of an angel visiting him in a cave on May 7, 1946, to officially launch his healing ministry. It's a powerful story. The only problem, if you look at historical records, like his own pamphlets and ads, he was already holding healing revivals and selling booklets about it back in 1945. It really seems like the grand supernatural origin story was added later on to make everything seem a bit more divine.
Now this next part is pretty tough. Underneath that public image of a simple, humble country preacher, there was a very disturbing connection. See, Branham always made it seem like he was just this independent man of God. But in reality, he was ordained and mentored by a guy named Roy E. Davis. And Roy Davis wasn't just some preacher. He was a known swindler, and he was the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. This is a shocking connection that Branham kept hidden from his followers, and it sheds a whole lot of light on where some of his more controversial racial teachings might have come from.
Okay, so his prophecies failed. His personal life story has some serious holes.
But what about his theology? You know, the unique divine revelations that he claimed God gave only to him. Let's move to our third and final pillar.
Okay, this one is just stunning. Branham taught that God personally revealed to him the secrets of something called the 7 church ages. It's a core teaching of his message. But take a look. When you put his divine revelation next to a book by a man named Clarence Larkin published decades earlier in 1918, the similarity is, well, it's undeniable. The charts, the names of the messengers, the timelines, it is almost a direct copy. It really looks like this revelation didn't come from heaven, but from a library shelf.
Now let's talk about maybe his most controversial doctrine, the serpent's seed. He taught that the original sin in the Garden of Eden wasn't about eating an apple. He said it was a sexual act between Eve and the serpent, and that Cain was the child of that union. So according to him, this created 2 totally separate bloodlines on earth, the children of God and the children of the devil. And he presented this as a deep, hidden mystery that only he, the special end-time prophet, was chosen to reveal.
But what does the Bible itself actually say about this? Well, if you just read it plainly, Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 seems pretty direct. It says, "And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain." The scripture couldn't be clearer. It says Cain's father was Adam.
So if the serpent seed idea didn't come from the Bible, where did it come from? Well, history shows it wasn't a new revelation at all, not even close. You can find versions of this teaching in ancient Gnostic heresies, and more recently, it was a pretty common belief in 20th century white supremacist groups. And that connects right back to the ideology of his KKK mentor, Roy E. Davis.
And you start to see how these kinds of unique doctrines often led to really high levels of social control in the group. For example, teachings that women were basically a byproduct of men, or strict rules that they couldn't cut their hair or wear pants. These rules served a very specific purpose. They helped isolate followers from the rest of society. It creates a really strong us versus them mindset, which makes it much, much harder for anyone to ask critical questions or even think about leaving.
So after looking at all the evidence, we finally get to the conclusion, and it seems like William Branham's entire ministry was built like a house of cards, resting on 3 really critical but really shaky pillars. First, you have the pillar of prophecy. And we've seen that when you hold it up to the biblical standard of 100% accuracy, it just doesn't stand. That pillar comes right out. Second, you have the pillar of his personal history. Major life events, like the Angelic Commission or that 1963 cloud, seem to have been completely rewritten after the fact to create this larger-than-life myth. So that pillar comes out too. And finally, the third pillar, his divine revelation. His most important theological ideas weren't unique or God-given at all. They were mostly borrowed or really plagiarized from other people's books. And down goes the third pillar. And all of this brings us to one final, really big question. When you pull away all 3 of those foundational pillars, when the prophet is proven to be false in his predictions, dishonest about his own past, and totally unoriginal in his theology, what in the world is left holding the whole house up? That's the question the historical record leaves us with.